The gates slammed shut. All 7 of them, one after another, iron against iron, the sound crashing through the morning air like the tolling of a funeral bell. Every guard on the estate snapped to attention. Every servant froze mid-step. Even the horses in the stable went still. And at the centre of it all stood Duke Caelum Draven, his jaw tight, his dark eyes burning with something that looked nothing like anger and everything like desperation. "No one leaves," he said. His voice was quiet. That was the terrifying part. It was not a shout. It was not a command, barked in fury. It was low, controlled, and absolute. "Bar every gate. Post 2 men at each door. Nothing moves in or out of these grounds until I say otherwise." His captain blinked. "Your Grace, the lady has already requested a carriage. She has done nothing wrong. She only asked to—" "I know what she asked." His jaw tightened further. "That is exactly why the gates are shut." 3 floors above, Annette Vale stood at the window of her small room, one travelling bag packed neatly beside her feet. She had asked for so little, a quiet exit. No fuss, no tears, no scene. She had written the letter herself, folded it cleanly, and left it on the breakfast table before the Duke had even risen. She had said her goodbyes to the housekeeper in a whisper. She had planned everything carefully so that she could disappear the way she had always lived in this house, silently, without trouble. But the gates were shut, and somehow, without a single word spoken between them, she already knew it was because of him. She pressed one hand flat against the cold glass and watched the guards take their positions below. Her bag sat ready, her heart sat heavy, and the question that had lived quietly inside her chest for 2 long years finally rose to her throat. Why, after all this time, would a man who never once asked her to stay suddenly refuse to let her go? Now, before we go further, tell us, have you ever stayed somewhere you knew you should have left, simply because leaving felt like losing something you never even had? Drop your answer in the comments. Tell us where you are watching from. And if this story already has your heart, hit that subscribe button, because what happens next will change everything. Annette Vale had not planned to stay long when she first arrived at Draven Hall. She had come as a replacement. The previous governess had left without notice, and the agency in London had sent Annette with nothing more than a letter of recommendation and a single trunk of belongings. She was 23 years old, quietly competent, and very good at making herself invisible. Those were the qualities the agency had listed. Those were the qualities the Duke had apparently required. She had expected a cold house. She had gotten one. Draven Hall sat on the far edge of the Devonshire countryside, like a man who had turned his back on the world. The stone walls were tall and grey. The gardens were trimmed with military precision, and every hallway inside smelled faintly of old wood and extinguished candles. The servants moved quickly and spoke rarely. The whole estate ran like a clock, every hour accounted for, every movement purposeful. Duke Caelum Draven was not present for her arrival. His housekeeper, Mrs. Porthen, a sharp-eyed woman with silver hair pulled back so tight it seemed to lift her eyebrows permanently, had received her at the door and walked her through the house with brisk efficiency. "The Duke is in London until Thursday," Mrs. Porthen had said, climbing the staircase without looking back. "Lady Petra is 7 years old, sharp-tongued, and does not suffer fools. You will find her more challenging than she looks. She has already dismissed 2 governesses this season." "Dismissed?" Annette had asked. "The child dismissed them?" Mrs. Porthen had paused on the landing and turned with a look that suggested Annette had just proven herself a fool. She told the first one that her stitching was crooked and her breath smelled of onions. She told the second that her singing sounded like a cat being stepped on. The Duke found both assessments accurate and let them go. A small, dry smile had crossed the housekeeper's lips. Lady Petra is very like her father. Annette had taken a quiet breath and followed Mrs. Porthen to the schoolroom. She had met Petra that same afternoon. The little girl was sitting at the schoolroom table with a book open in front of her, but she was not reading it. She was watching the door with sharp brown eyes that were older than 7 and had any right to be. Her dark hair was done in 2 neat braids. Her posture was perfect. She looked, Annette thought, like a small general preparing to receive an enemy. "You are the new one," Petra said. "I am," Annette agreed. She sat down across from the girl without being invited. "I have been told you are difficult." Petra blinked. That was apparently not what the others had said. And I have been told I am very patient, Annette replied. "So I suppose we are well matched." A silence followed. Petra studied her with those old, sharp eyes. Then she picked up her book again. "We will see," she said. It was, Annette would later understand, the closest thing to a welcome that Petra Draven ever gave anyone. The Duke had returned on Thursday as promised. Annette had heard his arrival before she saw him. The sound of hooves on the gravel drive, the sharp commands to the stable hands, the heavy footsteps across the entrance hall. She had been in the library at the time, selecting books for the following week's lessons, and she had stayed very still, not hiding exactly, but not rushing to introduce herself either. Mrs. Porthen had briefed him, she assumed. He would know a new governess had arrived. If he wished to inspect her, he would send for her. He did not send for her that evening. He did not send for her the next morning either. It was Petra who brought them together in the most Petra-like way possible. The girl had decided, 4 days into Annette's tenure, that she wished to practice her French conversation during the afternoon walk. Annette had agreed. They had walked the garden path that wound behind the east wing, speaking French about birds and weather, and the rather ugly garden statue that Petra declared looked like a confused pigeon. They had turned the corner near the stone bench by the rose hedge and walked directly into Duke Caelum Draven. He was not in his formal clothes. He wore a plain white shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows and dark riding trousers. His dark hair was slightly wind-disordered. He was holding a pair of riding gloves in one hand and looking down at a letter in the other, and he had clearly not expected to encounter anyone on that particular path. He stopped. They stopped. Petra looked up at him with complete calm. "Papa," she said in French, because they were still practicing, "you look like you have read bad news." He looked down at his daughter. Something shifted in his expression, very briefly, like a curtain moving in a window. "I have," he said, also in French, without missing a beat. Then his eyes moved to Annette. She held his gaze. She was good at that, at not flinching, at keeping her face composed when everything inside her was paying close attention. He was taller than she had expected. His face was harder too, all sharp angles and a jaw that looked like it had been cut from the same grey stone as his house. But his eyes were the detail that caught her. They were dark and very direct, and they looked at her not the way most employers looked at governesses, which was to say, barely, but with a kind of focused attention that felt, somehow, deliberate. "Miss Vale," he said, switching to English. "Your Grace," she replied. "Petra speaks well. She works hard," Annette said simply. "The progress is hers." Something moved at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, something quieter than that. He looked at his daughter again, and Petra, who was watching them both with obvious interest, immediately returned her gaze to the middle distance with elaborate innocence. "Carry on," the Duke said, and walked past them toward the stables. Annette watched him go for exactly 1 second before turning back to the path. "He liked you," Petra said in French, helpfully. "Continue your conjugations," Annette replied, also in French. That was how it began. Not with drama or declaration, not with a stolen glance across a ballroom or a hand held too long at a garden party. It began with French verbs and a garden path, and a man who looked at her like she was a problem he had not yet decided how to solve. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm. Annette taught Petra in the mornings, mathematics and reading and music and French. In the afternoons they walked or painted or worked on the small sewing projects that Petra tolerated with visible suffering. The Duke was often present in the house, but rarely visible. He had meetings with his solicitor, correspondence that kept him in his study for hours, and occasional trips to the village or to London that lasted 2 or 3 days at a time. But there were small moments. Dinner was served at 7, and on evenings when there were no guests, the Duke sometimes joined Annette and Petra in the smaller dining room rather than eating alone in the formal one. He would ask Petra about her lessons. Petra would answer with detailed and dramatic accounts that made even the driest mathematical exercise sound like an adventure. Annette would correct the most egregious exaggerations quietly, and the Duke would listen to both of them, with his dark eyes moving between them like he was watching something he did not quite have a name for. One evening, Petra had declared that she had memorized an entire French poem and wished to recite it. She had stood up from her chair, pressed her hands flat against her sides, and delivered the poem with the seriousness of a military general reporting casualties. When she finished, the silence lasted exactly 2 seconds before the Duke said, in French, "You missed the 3rd verse." Petra's eyes had gone very wide. "I did not." "You did. The one about the river." "There is no verse about a river." He had looked at Annette then. There was a light in his eyes that she had not seen before, something almost playful, and it struck her like a warm hand pressed briefly against her chest. "Miss Vale," he said, "is there a verse about a river?" Annette had kept her face very neutral. "There is, your grace, though I confess the young lady performed the rest of it beautifully." Petra had looked between them with the expression of someone who suspected she was being managed, but could not prove it. "I shall recite the whole thing again tomorrow," she announced, and sat back down with great dignity. The Duke had looked at Annette one more time, and this time he did smile, small, brief, gone almost before it arrived, but it was real. She had thought about it for 3 days afterward. It was not supposed to become what it became. Annette was practical. She had always been practical. She had grown up in a house where practicality was the only real currency, the 3rd daughter of a country vicar with more faith than income, and she had learned early that feelings were a luxury, best kept tidily inside one's chest, where they could not embarrass anyone. She knew who she was. She knew what her position was. And she knew, with the clarity of someone who had never allowed herself to be foolish, exactly where the line was between her world and the Duke's. She did not mean to cross it. She told herself that firmly. But then November came, and with it came the house party. The guests began arriving on a Wednesday. Annette had known they were coming because Mrs. Porthen had transformed into something between a general and a storm cloud for the 2 weeks prior, directing maids and footmen and kitchen staff with a speed that left everyone slightly breathless. The East Wing guest rooms were opened and aired. Extra candles were brought up from the cellars. The formal dining room was polished until it reflected the candlelight like still water. There were 8 guests in total. Lord and Lady Fenwick, a quiet couple from Bath who seemed to communicate primarily through eyebrow movements. Sir Rupert Ashby, a broad-shouldered man with a loud laugh and a habit of slapping people on the back when he found something funny. His wife Charlotte Ashby, who was small and sharp-tongued, and watched everything with the careful eyes of a woman cataloguing information for later use. A young widow named Dorothea Lane, who was lovely in the way that made rooms rearrange themselves around her, and 3 others, 2 younger gentlemen from London, and an older baron named Wickfield, who had known the Duke since their school days. Annette's role during the house party was to remain in the background. She had Petra in the mornings, as usual. In the afternoons, if Petra was required to participate in any activity with the guests, Annette accompanied her as escort and then removed herself as quickly as was politely possible. She took her meals in the schoolroom. She kept to the upper floors. She was, as she had always been, invisible. Except that it did not quite work that way. The first disruption came on the second day of the party. Petra had been invited to join the adults for afternoon tea in the garden, which was a rare honour and one she accepted with the gravity of a foreign diplomat. Annette had brought her down, settled her at the table, and was preparing to withdraw quietly when Lady Fenwick, who apparently did not believe in governess invisibility, had said loudly, "Oh, but surely Miss Vale will join us. There is plenty of room." 6 pairs of eyes had turned toward her, including one pair that was dark and very direct and gave nothing away at all. "Miss Vale has other duties," the Duke said. "Nonsense, Caelum. The poor woman has been buried upstairs all week," Sir Rupert said cheerfully. "Sit down, Miss Vale. Have some cake. Petra, does your governess like cake?" "She likes ginger biscuits better," Petra said seriously, "but she will eat cake if offered." The table had laughed. Annette had sat down, and for 1 hour on a cold November afternoon she had been part of something instead of outside looking in, and she had not known how much she had missed that feeling until it arrived. The Duke had not looked at her often during that hour, but every time he did it was the same, that focused, deliberate attention, like she was a sentence he was trying to read carefully. The second disruption came 3 days later and was considerably less comfortable. Annette had come downstairs late in the evening to return a book to the library. The house was quiet, the guests having retired for the night. She had moved through the dark corridor with a candle in hand, pushed open the library door, and found the Duke standing at the window with a glass of brandy, looking out at the black November garden. He turned at the sound of the door. She stopped. "Forgive me, Your Grace," she said immediately. "I did not know anyone was here. I will come back tomorrow." "Stay," he said. "Not a command, not quite a request, something in between." She stayed. She moved to the shelf, found the place where the book belonged, and slid it in. The silence between them was not uncomfortable, which was itself a strange thing, because silences between people of such different stations were almost always uncomfortable. "How long have you been a governess?" he asked. She turned slightly. He was still at the window, but he was looking at her now, rather than the garden. 4 years, Your Grace." "Do you enjoy it?" She considered the question honestly, because he sounded like he wanted an honest answer rather than a polished one. "I enjoy Petra," she said. "I enjoy teaching. The rest of it I have made my peace with." "The rest of it," he repeated. "You mean the invisibility?" She looked at him steadily. "It is the nature of the position." "Yes," he said. "I know." He looked back at the window. "I find it works that way with dukes as well. People see the title more than they see the man." She was quiet for a moment. "That is different, Your Grace." "Is it? You have power. I have none. The invisibility that comes with power is a choice. The kind that comes without it is simply the condition." He turned back to look at her again, and this time the look lasted longer. "That is a very precise observation." "I have had time to observe it," she said. Another silence. Then, quietly, "Good night, Miss Vale." "Good night, Your Grace." She walked out of the library with her candle, and she stood in the dark corridor for just a moment, with her back against the closed door, and she told herself, very firmly, that what she was feeling was nothing, just the strange intimacy of a late hour and a shared room and a conversation that had gone slightly past what was proper. She told herself that all the way back to her room, she did not quite believe herself. The house party ended on a Saturday. The guests departed one by one throughout the morning, carriages rolling down the gravel drive, while the house exhaled slowly back to its usual quiet. Annette watched from Petra's window as the last carriage, Sir Rupert's enormous black one, disappeared around the bend in the road. "I liked Sir Rupert," Petra said beside her. "He laughed too loud, but at least he meant it." "That is a very generous reading of him," Annette said. "Charlotte Ashby was watching you at tea the other day," Petra added, with the casual, devastating accuracy that was entirely characteristic of her. "She was watching Papa too. She was measuring something." Annette looked at the little girl. "You are far too observant for 7 years old." "I am almost 8, Petra said with dignity. 2 weeks after the house party, Dorothea Lane returned to Draven Hall. She arrived without the other guests, just herself and a maid and a very smart travelling carriage, and she was received with the quiet efficiency that suggested her visit had been arranged in advance. She was given the best guest room. She joined the Duke for dinner. She walked with him in the garden the following afternoon, her arm through his, her lovely head tilted toward him as they talked. Annette saw this from the schoolroom window. She turned back to the table immediately. "Continue your reading, please," she said to Petra, and her voice was entirely steady. Petra did not look up from her book, but she said, very quietly, "I do not think he likes her very much. Petra, he does not laugh with her. He laughed in the library last Tuesday, when you told me the story about the Frenchman and the goat. I heard it from the hallway." Annette pressed her lips together. "That is not an appropriate observation." "It is a true one," Petra said calmly, and turned the page. Dorothea Lane stayed for 5 days. During that time she was charming and gracious and very beautiful, and she looked at the Duke with the expression of a woman who had decided on something and was simply waiting for the paperwork. On her second evening, she had passed Annette in the upstairs corridor and stopped. "You are the governess," she said, with a smile that was perfectly pleasant and perfectly dismissive all at once. "I am," Annette said. Dorothea's eyes moved over her with quick efficiency. "Petra speaks very well of you. She told me at dinner that you are the smartest person in the house." A pause. A smile that sharpened almost imperceptibly. "Children say the most honest things, do they not?" "They do," Annette agreed. "Good evening, Mrs. Lane." She walked on without hurrying. But that night, alone in her small room, with the wind pressing against the window pane, Annette allowed herself something she very rarely permitted. She sat on the edge of her bed, and she pressed both hands flat against her knees, and she was honest with herself. She had feelings for the Duke of Draven, not small feelings, not the manageable kind that could be folded away neatly and forgotten, the kind that had been growing slowly and quietly for months, fed by French lessons at dinner and library conversations in the dark and one brief, real smile that had lasted less than a second and somehow stayed with her far longer than it had any right to. And it did not matter, not even slightly, because he was a duke and she was a governess, and there was a beautiful widow in his guest room who moved through the world like she had been made for exactly the kind of life he lived. She made a decision that night. She would finish the season. She would see Petra through her birthday in March. And then she would write to the agency and ask to be placed elsewhere, quietly, without fuss, without a scene. She would leave the way she had always lived in this house. She would go quietly. She did not anticipate that he would have something to say about that. She did not anticipate that he had been watching her far more carefully than she knew, and she did not anticipate what would happen on a cold January morning, 6 weeks later, when Duke Caelum Draven walked into the library at 9:30, closed the door behind him and said, without any preamble at all, "Someone has told me you are planning to leave." Annette looked up from the book she was cataloguing. Her hands were very still. "Who told you that?" He looked at her with those dark, direct eyes. "Does it matter?" She set the book down. "I was going to inform you properly, Your Grace, after Petra's birthday." "Why?" he said. "Just that. One word. Quiet and absolute." She met his gaze. "I think you know why." The silence that followed was long enough to be painful. He stood very still at the door, and she stood very still at the table, and the distance between them was exactly the width of everything that could not be said. "Stay," he said finally. Her chest tightened so hard it almost hurt. "Your Grace." "Stay," he said again. And then, more quietly, in the voice she had heard only once before, in a library at night, the voice that had nothing to do with titles or stations or the rules the world had built between them. "Please." She looked at him for a long moment. And then she did the hardest thing she had ever done in a life that had required her to do many hard things. She said, "I cannot." She picked up the book. She moved to the shelf. Her hands were perfectly steady as she slid it into its place. And she did not look at him again as she walked to the door, because she knew with complete certainty that if she did, she would not be able to keep walking. She went back upstairs. She sat at the schoolroom table. She taught Petra her mathematics with a calm, clear voice. And that night she wrote the letter. She placed it on the breakfast table before anyone was awake. She packed her bag. She asked Mrs. Porthen quietly for a carriage. She had asked for so little. She had asked only to go quietly. And then the gates slammed shut. Now pause for just a second. Tell us in the comments, what do you think the Duke is going to do next? The carriage never came. Annette stood at the window of her room and watched the courtyard below, with her travelling bag beside her feet and her hands folded in front of her like a woman at a funeral. 30 minutes passed, then 40. The stable hands moved about their usual morning work, but no carriage was brought out. No horses were harnessed. Nobody came upstairs to tell her it was ready. She picked up her bag and went downstairs herself. Thomas, the youngest footman, was standing near the entrance hall with the particular expression of a person who had been given instructions he found personally distressing. He was 19 years old and had a very honest face, which was making the current situation considerably worse for him. "Miss Vale," he said, and his voice cracked slightly on the second word. "The carriage, Thomas," she said gently. "I am very sorry, Miss Vale." He looked at the floor. "His Grace has given orders. No carriages are to be prepared this morning. No horses are to leave the stable. The gates are shut and the men are posted." She stood very still. "All of them?" "All 7, Miss Vale. I am very sorry." She turned and looked at the front door. Through the narrow windows on either side of it she could see the gravel drive, and at the end of it the great iron gate, and standing before the gate 2 of the Duke's men in their dark coats, facing outward like statues. Her jaw tightened. She set her bag down at the foot of the stairs very carefully, and she walked to the Duke's study. She did not knock. She pushed the door open and walked in, and the Duke was standing behind his desk with a letter in his hand, and he did not look surprised to see her. He looked, if anything, like a man who had been waiting. Captain Aldous Brent was in the room as well, standing near the window, a broad-shouldered soldier of 40, with a grey-streaked beard and the disciplined stillness of a man who had spent 20 years following orders he did not always agree with. He looked at Annette with the expression of someone who was trying very hard to be invisible. "Leave us," the Duke said to him. Brent left without a word, pulling the door shut behind him. The silence in the room was immediate and heavy. "You shut the gates," Annette said. "I did," said the Duke. "You have no right to do that." "I am aware," he said. She stared at him. He set the letter down on the desk and looked at her, and there was something in his face she had not seen before. Not the controlled hardness she was used to, not the brief, guarded warmth of their library conversation, but something raw, something that looked like a man who had run out of composure and was standing in the ruins of it trying to decide what to do next. "This is not legal," she said. "You cannot keep a person on your estate against their will. I am not your prisoner." "No," he said, "you are not." "Then open the gates." He said nothing. Caelum. The name left her mouth before she could stop it, and the moment it did, something shifted in the room like a door swinging open in a gust of wind. She had never used his name before, not once in 2 years. She watched his face change, something tightening across it, something opening behind his eyes, and she pressed forward because she did not know what else to do. "Open the gates and let me go." "Not yet," he said, and his voice was very quiet. "You said please yesterday and I said no. It was my answer. You must accept it." "I will accept it," he said. "When I have said what I need to say, give me 1 hour, 1 conversation, and if you still wish to leave after that, I will open every gate myself and put you in the finest carriage on the estate and ride with you to the station if that is what you want." She looked at him for a long, hard moment. 1 hour, she said. He moved from behind the desk. Not toward her, just away from it, to the fireplace, where a low fire was burning. He stood with one hand on the mantel and looked into the flames for a moment before turning back to her. "I have been a duke since I was 19 years old," he said. "My father died in October of that year. My mother had died the year before. I was handed a title and an estate and 400 people who depended on me, and absolutely no preparation for any of it." He paused. "I learned very quickly that the thing people wanted from me was certainty, steadiness, a man who did not waver, and so I became that. I built it so thoroughly that after a while I could not always find the difference between the performance and the person." She listened without speaking. "Petra's mother left when Petra was 2, he continued. "She did not die. She simply left. She found the life she had expected to have here and the life that was actually here to be 2 very different things, and she chose not to stay." His jaw tightened. "I told myself it did not matter. Petra was young enough that she would not remember. I would give my daughter everything she needed, and it would be sufficient." "It was not sufficient," Annette said softly. "No," he said, "it was not. Petra remembered more than I thought. Children always do." He looked at her directly. "And then you came, and within a week my daughter was laughing at dinner. Within a month she was reciting French poetry and arguing about garden statues, and for the first time in 2 years she was not watching me, with those eyes that knew something was wrong, even though she could not name it." Annette felt something tighten in her chest. "And I told myself that was all it was," he said, "that I was simply grateful, that what I felt when you were in a room was relief, not something else. I told myself that for 8 months, and I was remarkably consistent about it, and I was completely wrong." The fire crackled. Outside the window, the grey winter morning was getting lighter. "I am not asking you to stay as a governess," he said. "I am asking you to stay as yourself. As the woman who walked into my library told me that powerlessness and invisibility are different things, and looked at me as if she genuinely wanted me to understand the distinction." He stopped. "I am asking you, Annette, not as your employer and not as your duke, but simply as a man who has done a very poor job of saying what he means before this moment to to please not go. The room was so quiet she could hear the fire breathing. She had told herself she knew what she would do. She had the letter written and the bag packed and the shape of the goodbye already arranged in her mind. She had been so certain. She looked at him standing at the fireplace, and she thought about 2 years of small moments, and the way he had smiled at that dinner, and the library in the dark, and all the times she had told herself firmly that none of it was real or relevant. "You should have said something sooner," she said. Her voice was very even. "I know," he said. "I spent 6 weeks convincing myself to leave. I know that too." "And you shut the gates," she said, "which is not acceptable behaviour under any circumstance." "No," he agreed. "It was not." A pause. "But I would do it again." She looked at him steadily. "What exactly are you asking for, Caelum? Be precise." He held her gaze. "Everything," he said simply. "If you are willing." She did not say yes. She also did not say no. She said, "I need to think," and she walked out of the study with her back straight and her hands steady, and she climbed all 3 floors to her room, and she sat on the edge of her bed, and she pressed both palms flat against her knees. And she thought. She thought about the word everything and what it meant coming from a man like him. She thought about Petra, who had somehow known all along and never said so directly, which was so perfectly Petra that it almost made her smile. She thought about Dorothea Lane and Charlotte Ashby's watching eyes, and all the invisible lines the world had drawn between a duke and a governess, and what happened to women who tried to step across them. She thought about her father's house, small and cold and full of very good people who had never quite had enough of anything. She thought about 4 years of making herself invisible, and how tired it had made her in ways she had not admitted until this moment. She thought about the way he had said please. At noon, Mrs. Porthen knocked on her door. "Lunch is ready in the small dining room," she said, and then, with the careful precision of a woman choosing her words like stepping stones across a river, "His Grace asks if you will join him." Annette looked at her for a moment. Mrs. Porthen's sharp eyes gave nothing away, but she was standing very straight, and there was something in the set of her shoulders that looked almost like hope. "Yes," Annette said, "I will join him." She came downstairs to find not just the Duke but Petra as well, seated at her usual place, with her hands folded on the table, and her face arranged in an expression of perfect neutrality that was so obviously studied it was almost painful. "I asked to have lunch here today," Petra said to the middle distance. "It had nothing to do with anything." "Of course not," Annette said, and sat down. The Duke was already seated at the head of the table. He looked at her when she came in, a quick, searching look that asked a question he did not speak out loud. She met his eyes briefly and gave him nothing yet, and he accepted that with a small nod and reached for the bread. Lunch proceeded. Petra, who had apparently decided that casual conversation was the order of the day, talked at considerable length about a book she was reading about ancient Rome, with particular attention to what she described as the completely excessive number of columns in Roman architecture. The Duke asked 3 questions about columns. Annette answered one of them. They passed dishes back and forth, and the winter light came through the tall windows and lay across the table in long pale rectangles. It was so ordinary. That was the thing that undid her. Not the dramatic conversation in the study, not the locked gates or the word everything or the rawness on his face at the fireplace. It was this, lunch. Bread and cold meat and a 7-year-old talking about Roman columns and the ordinary quiet rightness of sitting at this table with these 2 people, as if it were simply what she was supposed to be doing. She reached for the butter dish at the same moment he did. Their hands did not touch. They were both very careful about that. But they both stopped, and they both looked. And in the space of that single stopped second, she made her decision. After lunch, she found him in the corridor outside the dining room. Petra had been intercepted by Mrs. Porthen about something involving the music room, and they were briefly and entirely alone. "I have conditions," she said quietly. He went very still. "I will not be hidden," she said. "I understand that what you are proposing is not simple, and that the world will have opinions about it, and that those opinions will be pointed and numerous. I am not asking you to ignore the world. I am asking you not to make me invisible inside your own house." "Never," he said. The word came out immediately, with a force that surprised them both. "I will need time," she said. "Whatever this is, it has to be built carefully, for Petra's sake most of all." "Agreed," he said. She looked up at him. "And the gates are to be opened immediately." He almost smiled. "They have been opened since 11 o'clock. She blinked. "You opened them before I gave you an answer?" "I told you I would," he said. "I promised you 1 hour and a conversation. I kept my word." She held his gaze. Something settled in her chest, warm and terrifying and real. "You are a great deal more complicated than you look," she said. "So are you," he replied. She stepped back, because they were standing very close and the corridor was very quiet, and she was still herself, practical and careful, and not yet ready to let go of all the structure she had built around her heart. "Then we will start there," she said, "at complicated." He nodded, and then, quietly, "Thank you." She turned to go back upstairs. She had lessons to prepare, and a changed future to think about, and a great deal of emotional reorganization to undertake. She made it to the foot of the staircase before she heard his voice again. "Annette." She turned. He was standing in the corridor looking at her, and for one moment all the careful control was entirely gone from his face, and he looked, just briefly, like exactly what he was. A man who had been very lonely for a very long time, and had not known how to say so until a woman with a travelling bag and very steady hands had tried to walk quietly out of his life, and he had found he could not allow it. "I am glad the gates are open," he said, "and I am glad you are still here." She looked at him for a long moment. "So am I," she said. She went upstairs, and below in the courtyard all 7 iron gates stood wide open in the January cold, and nobody came or went through any of them, because the only person who had needed to leave had decided, in the end, to stay. January became February, the way winters always do in Devonshire, slowly, stubbornly, with cold that pressed against the windows at night, and frost that painted the garden paths silver every morning. But inside Draven Hall, something had shifted. Not dramatically, not in the way of ballrooms and declarations and the whole world rearranging itself overnight. It shifted the way a fire catches, quietly at first, one small flame finding another, and then another, until the whole thing is burning steadily, and you realize it has been warming the room for longer than you noticed. Annette stayed. She told herself in the first week that nothing had changed. She was still the governess. She still taught Petra her lessons every morning. She still took her meals in the small dining room and kept to the upper floors when guests were present and maintained every boundary that her position required. She was practical. She was careful. She did not allow herself to float. But things had changed. Small things, real things. The Duke began appearing in the schoolroom doorway in the late afternoons, not intruding, just pausing on his way past with some observation about Petra's progress or a question about the week's reading. He brought books sometimes, old ones, from the deeper shelves of the library that he thought might interest Petra, or that he thought, and this was always left unsaid but entirely obvious, might interest Annette. He left them on the schoolroom table without ceremony, and she read them at night and left small notes tucked inside the front covers. observations or questions or the occasional disagreement, and the notes came back with his responses written in a hand that was very precise and slightly slanted. It was the most intimate thing either of them had done. Neither of them said so. Petra watched all of this with the serene satisfaction of a chess player who has seen the board clearly from the beginning and is simply waiting for the other players to catch up. She said nothing directly. She occasionally made observations to the middle distance that were almost comically pointed. "It is interesting," she said one morning while practicing her scales, "how a person can live in the same house as another person for 2 years and not actually see them until something forces them to look." "Play the left hand separately first," Annette said. "I am merely making a philosophical observation," Petra said, and played the left hand. On the 14th of February, which Petra announced at breakfast with great ceremony, was St. Valentine's Day, and therefore a day of historical significance that should be acknowledged by all civilized persons. A small envelope appeared on the schoolroom table between Annette's inkpot and her reading glasses. It had no name on the outside. Inside was a single card, and on it, in very precise, slightly slanted handwriting, were 4 words. "Still glad you stayed." She held the card for a moment. Then she tucked it into the inside pocket of her dress and went on with the morning. That afternoon, she left a card on the library table. It said 3 words. "Still glad too." She did not see his face when he read it, but that evening at dinner, he looked across the table at her exactly once, and the expression he wore for that single second was so unguarded and so quietly luminous that Petra actually stopped talking about Rome and looked between them with wide eyes before apparently deciding that some things were too significant for commentary. February moved into March, and with March came Petra's 8th birthday. The birthday was celebrated with a small party, just household staff and 1 or 2 families from the village, whose children Petra tolerated more than she liked, and a cake that Mrs. Porthen had clearly spent considerable personal effort on. Petra received her gifts with gracious dignity and wrote thank you notes the following morning without being asked, which Mrs. Porthen said was entirely Annette's doing and should be recognized as a significant civilizational achievement. But the gift that made Petra go still and silent in a way that was entirely unlike her usual composed self was the one from her father. It was a book, old and leather-bound and beautiful, a complete collection of French poetry, and on the inside cover he had written, in his precise slanted hand, for my daughter, who missed the 3rd verse but captured everything else. He had signed it simply, Papa. Petra had read the inscription twice. Then she had closed the book very carefully and held it against her chest and looked at her father with eyes that were suddenly and unexpectedly full, and the Duke had looked back at her with an expression that was so open and so real that Annette had to look away because it felt too private to witness. She looked away toward the window. Outside, the first suggestion of spring was beginning, very faint, barely a promise, but there in the slightly softer quality of the light. She felt him looking at her even before she turned back. When she did, his eyes moved from her face to the window and back, and something passed between them that was not a conversation, and not a touch, and not any of the things that stories usually made of such moments. It was simpler than that. It was just 2 people in the same room, both of them aware of the other, both of them aware that awareness had become something larger and more serious and more true. 3 days after Petra's birthday, trouble arrived at Draven Hall in the form of a carriage bearing the Draven family crest, which meant it belonged to someone the Duke had not invited. It was his aunt. Lady Constance Draven was 64 years old, had outlived 2 husbands, and what she described as the patience of a saint, and operated under the firm belief that being right about everything was both a gift and a burden she bore with remarkable grace. She was tall, angular, impeccably dressed, and she looked at the world with the expression of a woman who had found it perpetually disappointing but was prepared to correct it. She swept into the entrance hall like the weather. "Caelum," she said, kissing the air near his cheek, "you look tired. You are not sleeping. I can always tell." She turned and found Annette standing near the staircase, because Mrs. Porthen had not had time to warn anyone. Her eyes went to Annette with the swift precision of a hawk identifying something in a field. "This is the governess." It was not a question. "This is Miss Annette Vale," the Duke said. His voice was entirely calm. "She has been with us for 2 years and is responsible for the fact that Petra can now argue in 3 languages. Lady Constance looked at Annette for a long, measuring moment. Annette looked back without flinching. She had spent 2 years being looked at. She was very good at remaining steady under inspection. Said Lady Constance, and swept on toward the drawing-room. That evening, after dinner, while the Duke sat with his aunt over port in the drawing-room, Annette was upstairs settling Petra for bed, when she heard, through the floor, the particular quality of a conversation being conducted at low volume with significant intensity. She could not hear the words. She did not need to. Petra heard it too. She lay in her bed with her new poetry book on her chest and her eyes on the ceiling. "She will try to send you away," she said. "Petra, she will," Petra said, not dramatically, just factually. "She sent the last 3 governesses away. She told Papa they were unsuitable. She has opinions about what is suitable for this house." "And what do you think is suitable for this house?" Annette asked. Petra turned her head and looked at her. "You," she said simply, "and Papa being less sad. Those are the 2 most suitable things I can think of." Annette smoothed the blanket over the little girl's shoulders. "Go to sleep," she said softly. "He will not let her send you away," Petra said. "I know he will not." A pause. "But you must not let her frighten you either. She frightens people. It is her primary strategy." "I am not easily frightened," Annette said. "No," Petra agreed. She settled deeper into her pillow. "That is one of the best things about you." Annette sat with her until she slept. Then she went to her own room and sat at her small desk and looked at the dark window and thought about primary strategies and what it meant to hold ground, and how much easier it was to be brave on behalf of someone else than on behalf of yourself. The knock at her door came at 9:30. She opened it to find not the Duke, but Lady Constance, which was not what she had expected, and she stepped back automatically to admit her. Lady Constance entered the small room and looked around it with an expression that suggested she was cataloguing both the room and everything it said about its occupant. Then she sat, uninvited, in the single chair near the window and folded her hands in her lap with the composure of a woman who sat uninvited in rooms on a regular basis. "Sit down, Miss Vale," she said. "I dislike looking up at people during important conversations." Annette sat on the edge of the bed. Lady Constance. "My nephew," said Lady Constance, without preamble, "is not a simple man. He is not given to impulse or foolishness. He is, in fact, one of the most relentlessly careful people I have ever known, which is both his greatest strength and the thing that has made him very lonely for a very long time." Annette said nothing. She waited. "He has not looked at a woman the way he looks at you since before his wife left," Lady Constance said. "I noticed it in his letters before I noticed it in his face. Something changed in how he wrote about the house. Small things, references to conversations. A book someone had recommended, a French poem Petra had performed. She paused. He did not name you for 3 letters. When he finally did, it was as if he had been waiting to see whether saying it out loud would change something. Annette's hands were very still in her lap. "I am not here to threaten you," Lady Constance said. "I want to be clear about that, because I imagine you have been bracing for it. I am here because my nephew is important to me, and Petra is important to me, and I am 64 years old, and have buried 2 husbands, and I have no patience left for watching people fail to say what they mean until it is too late." She leaned forward slightly. "The world will be unkind about this," she said. "I will not pretend otherwise. There will be talk. There are always people waiting to talk. You will need to be stronger than you have ever been, and so will he, and it will not be comfortable, and it will not be simple, and anyone who tells you differently is lying to you." She sat back. "But I have watched my nephew carry everything alone for 9 years, she said. "And I have watched my great-niece grow up in a house that was beautiful and correct, and very quiet in all the wrong ways. And if you are the thing that changes that, Miss Vale, then the world's opinion is something I am prepared to manage." The room was very quiet. "Why are you telling me this?" Annette asked. "Because," Lady Constance said, rising from the chair with the ease of a woman who had never been stiff a day in her life, "Caelum will tell you everything he feels, and then stand very still and wait for you to decide, because that is who he is. He will not push, he will not press, he will open all the gates and then stand back and let you choose." She moved to the door. "I am simply making sure you understand what you are choosing between." She opened the door and paused. "You have a very steady face, Miss Vale," she said. "I respect that. It is considerably harder to maintain than most people realize." She left. Annette sat on the edge of her bed for a long time after that, in the quiet of her small room, while the house settled around her in the dark. She found him in the library. Of course she did. It was always the library. She was beginning to think there was something about that room, the old wood smell and the particular quality of the firelight on bookshelves, that made honesty easier than it was anywhere else in the house. He was at the window again, as he had been the first night they had spoken there, not looking out at the dark garden this time. He turned when she came in, and he looked at her with an expression that had given up on being careful. "She spoke to you," he said. "She did," Annette said. "I did not ask her to." "I know," she said. "It was better that she did." She came further into the room. The fire was low but still warm. She stood near the bookshelf, and he stood near the window, and the space between them was smaller than it had ever been, and felt smaller still. "I want to ask you something," she said, "and I want you to answer it honestly, not as a duke, and not as my employer, just honestly." "Always," he said. "Are you certain?" she said. "Not about the feeling, I believe the feeling, but about what comes after it. About the mornings and the arguments, and the parts that are not a library at night, and a Valentine card, and a man who says everything with a face that has finally stopped pretending." She looked at him steadily. "The ordinary parts, the relentless ordinary parts. Are you certain about those?" He was quiet for a moment. Not because he was uncertain, she could see that. He was quiet because he was taking the question seriously, turning it over, giving it the honest examination it deserved. "I have been living inside the relentless ordinary parts for 9 years, he said, "alone, with the title and the estate and the responsibility and the 400 people and all of it, every morning, every argument with solicitors, and every decision about the tenants, and every quiet dinner, and every night that ends in an empty room." He held her gaze. "I am not afraid of the ordinary. I have been afraid of ordinary being all there is." She felt something give way inside her chest. Not break, give way. The way a door gives way when the latch finally lifts. "I am not easy," she said. "I want you to know that before anything else. I have opinions, and I will say them, and I am not going to become invisible again for anyone, not even for you." "I know," he said. "I am counting on it." "Petra will be insufferable about being right," she said. Something warm moved across his face. "She already is. Your aunt is formidable. She is also, apparently, on your side," he said, "which means the rest of the world has already lost and simply does not know it yet." She laughed. It came out soft and surprised, and it moved through the quiet library like something breaking open after a long winter. And she watched his face when it happened, and she saw the way he looked at her when she laughed, like she was something he had not known he was waiting to see. She crossed the room, not all the way, halfway, far enough that the careful distance was gone. "Caelum," she said. "Annette," he said back, and the way he said her name was the same as always, precise and deliberate, but there was nothing careful about it now. It was just her name, said by someone who meant it. "I am staying," she said, "not because of the locked gates, not because of your aunt or Petra or any reason outside of myself." She held his gaze. "I am staying because I want to, because this is where I want to be, and I need you to understand that distinction because it matters to me." "It matters to me too," he said quietly. He reached out and took her hand. Just that. His hand around hers, warm and steady, and neither of them moved for a moment, just stood there in the library, with the fire burning low, and the dark January garden outside the window, and the whole complicated future arranged somewhere ahead of them, like a path that had not been walked yet. "What happens now?" she asked. "I would like to speak to your father," he said. "Properly, if you are willing." She blinked. That was not what she had expected. "My father is a country vicar in Somerset," she said. "He has a very small house and a very large Bible, and he will absolutely interrogate you about your intentions for a minimum of 2 hours. "Good," he said. "I have a great many intentions. It will take at least 2 hours to cover them adequately." She looked at him. "You are not what I expected," she said, "when I arrived here." "Neither are you," he said. The winter outside was still cold and dark, but standing in the library with her hand in his, Annette thought that cold and dark were very manageable things when you were not standing in them alone. In the weeks that followed, Draven Hall changed again. Not in the dramatic way that gossip required, but in the quiet, unmistakable way that truth changes things when it finally stops being hidden. The Duke wrote to Annette's father. The letter was long and very correct, and contained, between its formal lines, more genuine feeling than most letters managed in their entire length. Her father wrote back within a week. His reply was also long, considerably less formal, and included 3 Bible verses, a list of questions about the Duke's character that read slightly like an examination, and a postscript that said simply, "She deserves everything good. See that she gets it." The Duke read the postscript twice. Then he folded the letter carefully and put it in the inside pocket of his coat, which was where he kept things that mattered. He travelled to Somerset on a Thursday in late March, taking only Captain Brent and 1 footman, arriving at the vicar's small stone house in the late afternoon with 2 bottles of very good wine that he suspected the vicar would appreciate more than he would admit. The interrogation lasted 2.5 hours. Annette's father asked about the estate, about Petra, about the previous marriage, about his faith, about his temperament under pressure, and about what he believed a woman was owed by the man she chose to build her life beside. The Duke answered every question directly. On the way back to Devonshire, Captain Brent, who had waited outside the vicarage for 2.5 hours and had heard nothing because the walls were stone, and the vicar's housekeeper had offered him tea and kept him occupied with conversation about the local parish, said nothing for the first 20 miles. Then he said, "I take it went well, Your Grace." "He gave his blessing," the Duke said. Brent nodded. A pause. "And the questions?" "There were a great many of them." Another pause. "Did you answer them well?" The Duke looked out the carriage window at the Somerset countryside rolling past in the early spring light. "I answered them honestly," he said. He seemed to consider that sufficient. Brent nodded again. "She's a good woman, Your Grace. The household thinks so. I think so." End quote. "I know," said the Duke. "I have known for quite some time." April arrived, and with it arrived the announcement. It was handled with the quiet efficiency that characterized everything the Duke did when he had decided on a course of action. The solicitors were informed, the relevant members of the family were written to. Lady Constance, who had already known and had spent the intervening weeks preparing her response to anyone who had opinions about it, issued what amounted to a social decree from her London drawing-room that managed, without ever saying so directly, to make it clear that anyone who wished to remain on good terms with her would find a way to be gracious. The village, which had its own opinions and expressed them freely, was divided for approximately 2 weeks, and then largely reconciled to the situation on the grounds that Miss Vale had taught half their children French and mathematics, and was generally agreed to be sensible and capable and unlikely to make the Duke more difficult to deal with than he already was, which was the village's primary concern. The wedding was in June. It was small. Annette had been firm about that, and the Duke had agreed without argument, because he understood that a grand public spectacle was not what she wanted, and he had no interest in giving her anything she did not want. The church was the village one, old and slightly draughty and full of pale June light that came through the old windows and lay across the stone floor in long coloured rectangles. The guests were few. Lady Constance in the front row looking satisfyingly vindicated, Captain Brent standing very straight near the back, a handful of the Duke's oldest friends, Annette's father in his best coat, looking both proud and slightly tearful, her 2 older sisters beside him, and Mrs. Porthen, who had absolutely not cried and would deny it to her dying day despite the very clear evidence of her handkerchief. And Petra. Petra stood beside Annette during the ceremony, in a role that had been described officially as attendant, but which Petra privately considered to be more accurately described as the person who had made all of this happen by being very observant and saying precisely the right things at precisely the right moments. She held her small bouquet with perfect posture and watched the ceremony with the expression of someone watching the successful conclusion of a very long and complex project. When the vicar asked if anyone present had cause to object to the union, Petra turned and looked at the assembled guests with an expression that suggested she was prepared to debate any objections at considerable length and with supporting evidence. Nobody objected. Afterward, outside the church, in the June sunshine, while the small gathering moved around them, and Mrs. Porthen continued to not cry, Annette stood beside her husband and felt the particular weight of a moment that has finally become real after living for so long only in the private interior of oneself. She had arrived at Draven Hall with 1 trunk and a letter of recommendation and the careful, invisible armour of a woman who had decided that practicality was safer than hope. She had made herself small. She had done her work well and asked for nothing, and told herself that was enough. She had asked only to go quietly when the time came, and he had shut every gate. She thought about that now, standing in the June light with his hand warm around hers, and she thought that there was a version of herself that had walked out of those gates and taken the carriage and been practical and careful all the way to a new position in a new house and a new life of quiet invisibility. She could see that version of herself very clearly. She was sensible and composed, and she was also very lonely. "What are you thinking?" he said quietly, beside her. She turned to look at him. He was watching her with those dark, direct eyes that still did what they had always done, looked at her as if she were a sentence he was reading carefully. Only now she understood that he looked at her that way because she was the most important sentence he had ever encountered, and he did not want to miss a word. "I was thinking," she said, "about the gates." "The gates," he repeated. "It was a terrible thing to do," she said. "Objectively," he agreed, "and completely unreasonable." Without question, she looked at him, and I have never in my life been so glad that anyone did anything so unreasonable. Something moved through his face, warm and unhidden and entirely real. He lifted her hand and pressed his lips briefly against her fingers, which made Lady Constance nod in satisfaction from 6 feet away, and made Petra announce to no one in particular that she had known from the 3rd week that this would happen, and she wished people would simply listen to her in future. Captain Brent, standing near the church wall with a glass of something Mrs. Porthen had pressed into his hand, looked at the Duke and the new Duchess and the small, fierce child beside them, and thought that in 20 years of following the Duke of Draven through every hard and complicated thing the man had ever faced, he had never once seen him look the way he looked right now, like a man who had finally come home. The long Devonshire summer settled over Draven Hall like something exhaling. The gardens, which had always been precise and a little severe, softened gradually under Annette's gentle insistence that flowers were allowed to grow in directions that had not been formally approved. The library gained new books and small handwritten notes tucked into their pages. The formal dining room was used less often than the small one. Petra acquired a French pen pal, a development she announced at breakfast one morning with such elaborate casualness that both adults knew she had orchestrated it entirely herself. In the evenings, when Petra was in bed and the house was quiet and the summer light lasted long past what autumn and winter had allowed, Annette and Caelum sat in the library with books or letters, or simply the comfortable silence of two people who had stopped needing to fill the space between them with anything other than the plain fact of being together. One evening in late August, she was reading in the chair near the fire, which had become her chair in the way that things become yours in a house where you are truly at home, and he was at the desk with his correspondence, and the room was quiet and warm and smelled of old books and the faint, lingering sweetness of the summer garden through the open window. He looked up from his letter. She felt him looking and glanced up from her book. He said nothing. He just looked at her for a moment with that expression that had no careful armour over it any more, nothing controlled or guarded, just the plain, honest face of a man looking at the person who had changed everything by refusing, in the end, to go quietly. She looked back at him, steady, warm, entirely sure. Outside, the Devonshire evening was long and golden and unhurried. The 7 great gates of Draven Hall stood open, as they had stood every day since that cold January morning when a woman with one bag and a folded letter had decided that going quietly was no longer what she wanted. She had stayed, and in staying, she had given them both something neither had known to ask for until it arrived. Not just a love story, not just a rescue or a resolution or a happy arrangement between suitable parties. Something quieter and more enduring than any of those things. Something that looked, from the inside, like an ordinary evening in a library at the end of a long summer day. Something that looked, finally, like enough. And if this story has moved you, if it has made you feel something you did not expect to feel today, then tell us in the comments what part hit you hardest. Was it the locked gates, the library conversations, Petra who saw everything from the beginning, or the moment she finally chose to stay not because she had to, but because she wanted to? Tell us below, and if you have not subscribed yet, please do it now, because there are more stories like this one waiting for you, and you deserve every single one of them.